Hello everyone, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the ninth webinar of our knowledge building series on reclaiming adl and ihsan in Muslim marriages between ethics and law. Thank you for joining us from all over the world. We're very grateful for your engaging presence. This is what makes our conversations so rich, and we really appreciate your questions and reflections shared throughout the last webinars. My name is Sarah Marceau, and I'm the coordinator of Musawah's Knowledge Building Working Group, and I will be the housekeeper for today's event. The previous webinars looked at marriage from a fiqh, historical and legal perspective, and our last two webinars featured the work of our scholars on Quranic teachings and marriage from a holistic and ethically oriented reading, with Amira Abu Talib, followed by Umayma Abu Bakr, Asma Namrabet, and Mulki Al-Sharmani. If you missed these webinars or the previous ones, you can watch all the recordings in Musawah's YouTube channel. But today we have the honor to have with us four groundbreaking scholars and activists, the wife and husband team, Dr. Sarah Ababneh and Dr. Shadab Rahemtulla, Musawah's advocate and friend, Mrs. Hadil Azim from Iraq, and our very own Dr. Marwa Sharafuddin. Together, they will discuss and reflect on the marriage of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ with Khadija to question hegemonic narratives on ideal Muslim marriages. But before I hand over to Marwa Sharafuddin, who will be the moderator for this session, I have a few housekeeping items to share with you. And if my colleague Rasha could please go to the next slide. So this webinar is also being live streamed via our Facebook page and will be available on our YouTube channel. Participants who are joining us on Zoom will be able to ask questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. If you don't get to your question during today's webinar, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us via email, and you can use the email that is on the screen now. Please use the chat function if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, and I will be there to assist you. I will also share resources, any reference material that the speakers refer to in the chat. If you are tweeting or posting about this webinar, please don't hesitate to tag us at Musawah on Twitter and at Musawah Movement on Facebook and Instagram. Now let me introduce you to our moderator, Dr. Marwa Sharafuddin, a dear colleague, teacher and friend. Marwa is an Egyptian scholar activist. She has a PhD in law from the University of Oxford and is the senior technical advisor and MENA region expert in Musawah. She has been published in a number of academic books and media platforms covering the topics of Muslim family laws. She co-founded or served on the advisory boards of several feminist organizations worldwide, such as the Global Fund for Women, the Young Arab Feminist Network, the Network for Women's Rights Organizations in Egypt, and Musawah, of course. She also contributed to many publications, such as the United Nations flagship report Progress on the World's Women in 2029-2020, and the UN Gender and Justice and the Law in the Arab State region report. And the most important thing, Marwa is a story collector, an outstanding performer, and a writer. So we are very privileged to have Marwa with us moderating this discussion. Thank you. And now I'm going to hand over the webinar to Marwa.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'd like to welcome everyone. We have people joining us today from all around the world to discuss an intriguing set of universal issues: love, marriage, power, and masculinity. Many Muslims far and wide look to the Prophet's light, peace be upon him, as an example, following his sayings and actual practices. His marriage to Sayyida Khadija, in particular, shows us an interesting example of how a Muslim marriage can be conducted, questioning deeply the notions we hold today about masculinity, authority, and family life. Marriage and family are important places where masculinity manifests and is reproduced. Masculinity today seesaws between caring, providing for, and protecting your family on one hand, and between exercising violent behavior on family members and others to exhibit physical strength, control, and power on another. Providing financially for your wife and family is considered masculine behavior, but so is prohibiting your wife from working outside the home in certain contexts. Protecting your daughter and son from sexual harassment is part of exhibiting a protective masculinity. But so is beating or killing that very same daughter if she tarnishes the family's honor by living alone elsewhere for work or study in some contexts. Interestingly enough, our family laws and practices contain an eclectic mixture of both types of masculinity. the healthy kind that promotes life, and the toxic one that diminishes it. And so we want to go back to the Prophet for guidance. How did he conduct himself in his marriage with the Sayyida Khadija? Can he help us, both men and women, have better clarity on the type of marriage, family, and conduct that we need to live a better life? This is important to talk about because most of our Muslim family laws today are based upon jurists' own conceptions of what a Muslim marriage should look like. They built their model of marriage based on certain assumptions they made about masculinity and femininity. This eventually affected the roles, duties, and rights of family members. So, who obeys who? Who spends on who? Who has the right to unhampered sexual access? Who can discipline who? Who has the right to custody of the children? Who can go out to work freely or not? Who performs the unpaid domestic labor? Who inherits more or less? And the list goes on, as you well know. It is important because these assumptions and the family laws based on them not only reach into our private homes and bedrooms, but also into our public citizenship rights, not to mention, of course, our material wealth and the size of our bank accounts. By looking at the Prophet's marriage to Sayyida Khadija, we are really given a hidden treasure that helps us to re-examine some of these assumptions underlying our family laws and practices today, which do nothing less than shape our life. Is there really such a thing as a fixed Muslim masculinity or marriage model? And do these change with time, thus necessitating a change in laws? The Prophet's marriage to Khadija helps us to ask these questions about current notions of masculinity and femininity, rights and duties, laws and practices, love and authority. Basically, it helps us question our life as we see and practice it today. Helping us navigate what has now become a webinar on the existentialist crisis of the meaning of life, we have the privilege of listening to a power team of stellar scholars who happen to be married to each other themselves. We have Dr. Sara Ababneh, who is assistant professor at the University of Jordan Center for Strategic Studies. She's the head of the Political and Social Studies Unit and CSS Internship Program Coordinator. Dr. Ababneh earned her DPhil in Politics and International Relations from the University of Oxford in 2010. Her research focuses on issues of class, gender, and Islamism, Muslim family laws, labor movements, and struggles for liberation and change. She's now working on a manuscript on the popular protest movement in Jordan. Dr. Shaddad Rahemtulla is lecturer in Islam and Christian-Muslim relations at the School of Divinity, University of Edinburgh. A Canadian Muslim from Vancouver, Dr. Rahemtulla completed his doctorate in contemporary Islamic thought at the University of Oxford as well. He is the author of the book Quran of the Oppressed, Liberation Theology and Gender Justice in Islam in 2017. His primary interest lies in how religion can be reinterpreted as a liberating force to confront contexts of oppression, including patriarchy, poverty, and racism. His second book project seeks to reread the Quran in light of the Native American rights, occupation, and indigenous struggles against settler colonialism. As a discussant, we are very happy to have with us also today a seasoned activist, living and working in a very challenging context in Baghdad, Iraq. She will share with us her reflections on the interventions from the previous speakers from her standpoint of lived reality. Ms. Hadil Hazem works with Kvina Tikvina, the Woman to Woman Foundation, as a senior program officer based in Baghdad since 2015. Mrs. Hazem has worked with women's human rights since 2004, worked with Islamic Relief Iraq as head of Gender and Family Support Department for 8 years, and she was nominated by Islamic Relief to be awarded by the Islamic Bank in 2009. Ms. Hazem is founder of Maryam Association in 2004 in Baghdad, targeting widows and orphans. She participated in many initiatives relating to women's rights, gender, women's economic empowerment, and peace building. As you know, this webinar is part of Musawah's research initiative titled Reclaiming Adl and Ihsan in Muslim Marriages Between Ethics and Law. The aim of this new research inquiry is to help build and promote an understanding of marriage as a partnership of equals through studies such as this one with Dr. Sara and Dr. Shaddad. In particular, this webinar's objectives are, number one, to challenge and deconstruct hegemonic masculinities in the context of Muslim marriages through the model of the Prophet Muhammad and his wife, Sayyida Khadija, and two, to initiate a conversation on the ways through which we can reclaim this relationship in the present time as a model for, listen to this, feminist Muslim masculinities. So without further ado, let's go ahead with our first question. So, Sarah and Shaddab, let's start with your positionality. Yeah. When you embarked on this research, we know that any knowledge, even the knowledge we create about the divine and the sacred, it's always constructed from a position. So it's important to start this webinar with your own positions whilst creating this knowledge. Now, given that you're both married, what drew you to study the relationship between Prophet Muhammad and Sayyida Khadija? Because there are several models of prophetic marriage. How did you relate to these different models that were available to you when you decided to get married? And why particularly Khadija? You have 2.5 minutes each. Equality.
Thank you. Oh, we have to unmute ourselves.
You are unmuted.
Okay. Thank you, Marwa. And thank you for everyone who is there from all around the world. I'm really, really excited that you're here. And I'm actually very happy that my husband is next to me and not joining us from a different continent. So one of the things is we all know in terms of this ideal Muslim marriage, we've all experienced it either personally or, we have this image of what an ideal Muslim marriage is like. And it's usually based on the Prophet's marriage to Aisha, radiallahu anha. So it is of a young wife who's married to an older husband, of somebody the husband who provides for her, who's secure, who's financially secure. She comes to live in his house. It is, he is the leader, he's the head of the household. And she comes and she is usually seen in the domestic sphere. And this is usually the way we understand an ideal Muslim marriage. And of course, all of us have grown up with stories of Sayyidina Khadija radiallahu anha. We know her, we love her, we've learned about her since first grade, since kindergarten, some of us. She's not somebody who's absent in Islamic thought or Islamic education. But the difference is that when we speak about Sayyidina Khadija radiallahu anha, her marriage to the Prophet has not become an ideal. We don't think, a marriage should be, ideal marriage is if a wife is 15 years older than a husband. It's not when she has been his former employer. This is not how we conceptualize ideal marriage. And of course, we've encountered this. We encounter this every day. Personally, in terms of what we strive for, what kind of ideal person we want to marry, and what kind of ideal wife or husband we want to be, but also in the law, in actual laws that prevent us from marrying certain people and tell us that we need to marry other people. So when we met, in a sense, we weren't like the ideal. I am 3.5 years older than Shaddab. We met while we were doing our PhD, but I was at the end of my PhD. He was at the beginning of his PhD. And then we ended up moving to Jordan, my country. So actually, when we started researching the Prophet's marriage to Khadija, we found much more that was similar to our situation than the kind of what we usually think of as an ideal Muslim marriage. And I'm gonna move over to Shaddab.
So I also want to thank Musawah for hosting us. We're delighted to be here, and we really look forward to your feedback, and we look forward to learning from you as well. We're coming from a liberation theology framework, and in liberation theology, it's your social context. It's your immediate lived experiences that come first. And religious texts are then engaged in light of those lived experiences. So the question then becomes, what was our marital experience? What was our context? And basically, as Sarah has touched upon, our experience was one of parity. It was one of equality. So for example, as Sarah noted, we have the same educational background. And we actually met as PhD students in the UK. And we actually first met at the Palestine Society table at Freshers' Fair at Oxford. And Freshers' Fair is where all the new students come to join different clubs and different organizations. And when we got to know each other, we realized that we not only had the same anti-colonial politics, but we also had the same religious politics. We didn't see we didn't see a contradiction between Islam and social justice, between Islam and gender equality. So the point is that we related and we continue to relate to each other, not only as husband and wife, but also as scholars, as social activists, and as fellow believers in struggle. So this is our social context. It is a relationship of equality. And we were looking for an Islamic model that could speak to that context. The Prophet's marriage to Khadija spoke to us in a way that his marriage to Aisha simply couldn't, even though Aisha is the idealized marriage model in Muslim cultures.
Amazing. So it's wonderful that you were able to find yourselves in that particular prophetic marriage model. And it was one that inspired the equality that you already lived in your relationship. And by the way, reading your bios, it was so easy to see why you eventually ended up married, precisely because of what you just mentioned right now, the equality in the education, in the politics, this interest in liberation struggles. So this is actually where your research is important. You are examining the marriage of Prophet Muhammad and the Sayyida Khadija to question these hegemonic narratives on ideal Muslim marriages. So can you please share with us in what ways Muhammad's marriage with Khadija was a very different and maybe what we would consider today a healthy alternative to the fiqh-based model of marriage, which we have in our laws, and that is basically centered around the husband's duty of financial maintenance in return for a wife's obedience. And I think, Shaddeb, you would like to take that one? You have 10 minutes, yeah?
Okay, thank you, Marwa. That's a really important question, and it's also a huge question. So I'll focus on Khadija up to her marriage proposal to the Prophet. So what do we know? We know that she was a wealthy businesswoman. She was a major player in the trade routes of 7th century Arabia, and according to the 8th century historian Ibn Sa'ad, Khadija's caravan was, quote, equal to the general caravan of the tribe of Quraysh, end quote. So that's the whole tribe of the Prophet. It seems from the sources that she inherited the trade business from her father, Khuwaylid ibn Asad, but she also expanded it considerably. The business achieved its size and its reach because of her own skills and ability as an entrepreneur. And this is the context in which Khadija and the Prophet met. She heard about the Prophet's character and his honesty, and she hired him to trade her goods in Syria. So that's the first thing. We know that she was a wealthy businesswoman. We also know that she was a divorcee and a widow. Khadija had been in 2 previous marriages. Her first marriage was to Abu Hala ibn an-Nabash from the tribe of Tamim, and with him she had 2 children, and that marriage ended in divorce. Her second marriage was to Atiq ibn Abid, from the tribe of Makhzum. They had 1 child together, and Atiq passed away. I think this is significant because it shows that Khadija was not a virgin when she met the Prophet. That's a critical, idealized part of Muslim marriage. As we all know, in Muslim societies, there's a lot of stigma associated to divorcees and to widows. And this goes back to the Aisha model, where virginity is prized. I think it says something that in the classical biographical sources, there is no stigma whatsoever attached to Khadija as a divorcee or as a widow or as a non-virgin. And the classical historians, they didn't see this as a problem. This seems to be a modern 20th/21st century taboo. We also know that Khadija was the one who proposed. She was interested in the Prophet and she acted on that interest. She didn't passively wait for the man to propose. And I think that's also a very modern notion. The first authoritative biography of the Prophet was by Muhammad ibn Ishaq, and he lived in the 8th century. In Ibn Ishaq's biography, we have the actual wording of Khadija's proposal, and I'll ask the organizers to share that quote on the chat. It reads, quote, "O son of my uncle, I like you because of our relationship and your high reputation among your people, your trustworthiness, your good character, and your truthfulness, end quote. Now, silence matters. If a woman proposing was odd at that time, the historians would surely have commented on it. They would have remarked on Khadijah's audacity. But the historians didn't find it strange at all. In fact, in his famous history, the 9th century scholar Abu Ja'far al-Tabari writes, quote, "All the men of her tribe would have been eager to accept this proposal had it been made to them," end quote. And like Ibn Ishaq, al-Tabari also includes the actual wording of Khadijah's proposal. I want to end with one more thing. We also know that Khadija was significantly older than the Prophet. The most well-known number is that at the time of their marriage, Khadija was 40 and the Prophet was 25. We can't take the number 40 literally. The fact that Khadija went on to have 6 children with the Prophet suggests that she was likely younger than 40. And if you look at the classical sources, we actually have different numbers. Khadija could have been 35 or even 25. The Prophet could have been 23 or even 21. The exact numbers aren't important, but what's important is what the numbers represent. They show A, that Khadija was considerably older than the Prophet, and B, that she was not a young woman, but a mature and socially established woman. Again, I think textual silence is important. I think it says something that the early biographers didn't find anything strange about that age difference, because if they did, they would have commented on it. So connecting this back to our own context, this is something that Sarah and I could also relate to. As Sarah's noted, she's 3.5 years older than me, and that's clearly at odds with the dominant Aisha paradigm, where the man is manifestly older. And age has consequences. When the man is the older partner, that of course leads to a power disparity within the marriage itself.
So I'm going to continue on from this, and I'm going to talk about how their marriage was actually, what their marriage looked like and what the Prophet looked like when he entered the marriage. Mm-hmm. So the first thing is that when he entered the marriage, the Prophet went and he lived in Khadijah's house. So it was a matrilocal marriage. Matrilocal means that a man moves into his wife's house or territory, versus patrilocal, where the wife moves into the man's territory, which is of course the dominant narrative now. And in a sense, it is almost unheard of. The idea that something is not patrilocal is almost sounds sacrilegious Islamically to say, because it is inscribed in the personal status law, and I'm going to talk about this in a little bit. And because in personal status law, actually the foundation of obedience and ta'ah is that the wife lives and stays in the house of the husband. And if she leaves that house without a legitimate reason, that is considered disobedience, which then allows the husband not to stop his duties, which are maintenance, etc. So there's this whole structure, and of course Musawah has done a lot of work around this and research around this about maintenance and obedience, and that is actually connected to the fact that you live in the wife lives in her husband's home. So it's that is the premise for qawwam. So that's the first thing. So the Prophet moves into his wife's house. The second thing is that when the Prophet entered marriage, he was economically vulnerable. He was not a strong economic player. In fact, he was poor. In 7th century Arabia, a mature person, you could only inherit if you were already an adult. And because the Prophet's father, Abdullah, and his grandfather, Abdul Muttalib, both died when he was still a child, he didn't inherit from them. So he actually didn't have money. And pre-modern sources actually have no problem with the fact stating that the Prophet was poor, and they don't see it as something that is problematic. They'll just state it as a fact. And in fact, there's this legend around this, where when the Prophet receives the proposal from Sidna Khadija, he then realized that he actually doesn't have enough money to pay for the dowry, for the mahr. And at that point, legend has it that Angel Gabriel comes and the gems come from the sky. Now, we're not talking about whether this is true or not. This is not the point. What this is about is that there was absolutely no shame associated with the fact that he could not pay the dowry. It didn't make him less of a man. It wasn't a cause for shame for Muslims to think, oh my God, our Prophet wasn't even able to pay the mahr. It was not an issue. So the Prophet enters marriage very economically insecure, and it is through marriage that he gets economic security. Firstly, he moves up economically, but he doesn't just move up economically. He reaches economic security to a degree that he is able to go to Ghar Hira. He is able to have that time off where he can just think and ponder, which is, of course, where he then receives the first revelation. So his marriage to Khadija enables him, in a sense, to become a prophet. It gives him the time to think about things that are beyond making money. And it's not just the Prophet that Khadija provides with economic security, it's also early Muslims. Now, in most Sunni sources, Abu Bakr is usually the Prophet's companion and friend is usually seen as one of the people who is kind of the benefactor of the early Muslim society. However, there are also sources that suggest that Khadija provided early Muslims with food, shelter, financial aid, especially during the time that Quraysh boycotted Muslim labor. So it's during that time Muslims weren't allowed to work for Quraysh, and Quraysh was trying to starve Muslims out. And actually it ended up with two groups of Muslims fleeing to Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia, because the Christian king Najashi had provided sanctuary for them. And there's a suggestion that it was the wealth of Sidna Khadija that enabled early Muslims to do so. But it's not just that she enabled Muslim society, she probably also lost her fortune doing so. Layla Ahmed notes that at the time of her death, there are no records that the Prophet or his daughters, their joint daughters, inherited anything from Khadija, which suggests that she probably had lost all her wealth. There's also suggested the fact that she died in 1619, which is the very end of the Meccan boycott, suggests that there was a lot of kind of strain on her, not just monetary strain, but probably also physical strain. So let me conclude what I said. So who was the Prophet as Khadija's husband? He was a husband who lived in his wife's house. He was a substantially younger husband. He was a financially dependent husband. And he was a husband who was in a monogamous relationship with his wife for over 25 years. And now there's suggestions that that might have been because Sayyidah Khadija wrote this into her marriage contract. And there are also suggestions that Fatima, her daughter with the Prophet, also had it as one of the clauses in her marriage contract that Ali bin Abi Talib radiyallahu anhu not marry anyone else.
Wow, that's very powerful knowledge, actually, to know today when not just the practices of family practices, but also the laws that are governing families in Muslim contexts are so different than what you guys are telling us. What you say is so far from that legal reality that we have today. And so maybe you can give us some examples where the laws and practices we have today resist this prophetic marriage model, despite claiming that they are laws inspired by the Quran and the practices of the Prophet. So I know that, Sarah, you would like to take this up first. You have 7 minutes.
Thank you. So basically, I'm going to talk about laws, and I'm going to talk about attitudes. So in terms of laws, I'm going to talk about 3 laws. The first one is kafa'a. Kafa'a means compatibility. But when it comes to personal status law or family law, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at Jordanian family law. So in Jordanian family law, monetary kafa'a is defined as the husband being able to provide for his wife monetarily, financially, in a manner that she is accustomed to from her father's house. So she provide her with a standard of living that is similar to the standard of living she has had in her kind of parental home. In fact, according to Articles 22b, if the guardian was not consulted, so has not given his approval to the marriage, he can dissolve the marriage if the husband isn't kafu. He can't do it in any other case, only if the husband isn't a financial kafu, financially compatible, then a guardian can dissolve the marriage. So this is a big thing. So what we're saying here is that the law actually says that people who marry each other, the husband have to be of the same socioeconomic background, or the husband has to be of a higher socioeconomic background. So this is actually enshrined in the law. That's the first law I want to talk about. The second law I've already talked a little bit about, which is this whole idea of ta'a and wilaya, and this idea of what does it mean to be disobedient or nashes. And it basically means, in Jordanian personal status law, it means leaving the house of the husband without a musawah shari, without a reason to do so. So again, what does it mean? So what does that actually mean in terms of, is ta'a then an inherent right? That does a Muslim wife need to obey her husband? What if he doesn't? Is it only because she lives in his house? What if he is not, he doesn't pay maintenance for her? What if she doesn't live in his house? What does that mean in terms of how we understand these things as actual divine laws or as things that change? The third legal aspect of this is, of course, the marriage contract. And the marriage contract is probably amongst the greatest forms of empowerment that we have at our disposal, but maybe the most underused form. Now, in Jordan, when you look at the majority of marriage contracts, the conditions that people put in there is the mahr, is the dowry. That is it. And I've had numerous conversations myself with young women saying it is so important that you put clauses in there, put everything you can in there, and say, no, we can't, my family is against it, I don't want to, if we say this, I don't want to put him in this kind of position, he needs to feel this is really emasculating. So there's a lot there socially against providing, putting clauses in the marriage contract. The suggestions that even the wife of the Prophet, the daughter of the Prophet, with the fourth Imam, had actually these marriage contracts. And of course, there's much more there. If you look at the early Sirah, the early Muslims, in terms of what they put in their marriage contracts, it would be shocking to a 21st century audience. And I think we can learn a lot from that. And finally, current attitudes. So if you look at current attitudes, it's actually really interesting, and this was something that was really great in the research, to see the kind of the outrage and the difference in outrage between early scholars and commentators and between modern scholars and commentators. So we have Martin Lings, who has provided a really comprehensive biography of the Prophet. But one thing he fails to note is the Prophet's inability to pay the dowry, the mahr. And of course, this silence is extremely telling. It is a silence for Lings. He could not have a figure of the Prophet, of a Prophet who cannot pay the dowry. That for him, and it speaks, of course, to the sensibilities of the 21st century and not to those of early century Arabia. And Shadab just wants to make another
please.
current attitudes.
Yeah, you have time.
Sorry, I just want to make one point and add that on to what Sarah said. When we were doing the research, we found this quote on Khadijah's life by a modern Muslim scholar. And I think this quote sums up the dominant view of an idealized Muslim marriage. And I'm going to ask the organizers to share that quote on the chat. I quote, "Once Khadija was married, she appears to have lost interest in her mercantile ventures and in her commercial empire. Of course, she never lost her genius for organization. Now, instead of applying it to her business, she applied it to the service of her husband." From the very first day, she took charge of her new duty, which was to make the life of her husband happy and pleasant, end quote. I can assure you, there is nothing in the classical sources to suggest that Khadija gave up her career and became a good Muslim housewife. On the contrary, as Sarah noted, it is likely precisely because Khadija continued to earn that the Prophet ﷺ was able to be in the cave of Hira, to spend extended periods meditating in the cave of Hira, and that was the context in which he received revelation. This quote tells us more about the author's own conservative views on Muslim marriage than it does anything historical about Khadija's life. So as critical Muslims, we need to be very careful about what is passed as quote-unquote Islamic knowledge. Many times we are told, this is Islam, this is what happened, and we're told that by religious authorities. But sometimes that's actually just the view of the person saying it. So I just wanted to add that point.
Thank you. This is very important, really. What is it that we take from our history and heritage? And what is it that we leave out? But not just leave out, also transform to fit our current views of life and how things should be. And of course, you know, what you mentioned about the marriage contract conditions, we have so many stories of women and men together deciding to put marriage contract conditions. And it's the ma'zoons, the religious figure that convenes the marriage, that refuses that, even though that's perfectly shari'i to do so. And so again, it's interesting, this interplay between the heritage, the tradition, the laws, but also how that is taken in this reality. So my third question to you then is, if the Prophet Muhammad, as the Quran says, is to be a good role model, uswatun hasana, then what do we learn from his marriage to Khadija? How can it inform our reimagining of Muslim marriages and the Islamic grounds for egalitarian gender roles and relations within these marriages? So please, go ahead.
That's a great question. I think this marriage shows us that patriarchy has had a big say in what constitutes the Sunnah and what doesn't. Patriarchy has had a big say in what constitutes the Sunnah, prophetic precedents, and what does not. Conservative Muslims have latched on to the Aisha experience and have presented this as the idealized model. This is the Sunnah of marriage. Why not Khadija? Why hasn't the Prophet's 25-year marriage, the Prophet's 25-year precedent with Khadija, also become a part of the Sunnah? Now, some critics might say that's because Khadija represents a pre-Islamic marriage, whereas Aisha represents an Islamic marriage, and I don't think that's a fair assessment. Firstly, Khadija had a major presence during the first Quranic revelations. All the sources attest to that. She was the one who believed in the Prophet right away. And secondly, Khadija and the Prophet had about 10 years together after the Quran was revealed. Their marriage was 25 years long. 10 of those years were during the Islamic period. And during this period, the Prophet didn't leave her. He didn't try to reshape their relationship to make it more patriarchal and quote-unquote Islamic. Their relationship continued as it was. And the only reason it ended was because Khadija died in about 620. So why hasn't Khadija's marriage become a part of the Sunnah as well? As Muslims, we all know about her great status as a believer. We all know how important she was as a support to the Prophet. But we're never encouraged to emulate their relationship. And I think that's the case because men have historically shaped what we consider as a model. As a powerful woman, Khadija just didn't fit into male preferences for what an ideal marriage should be. Now, since marriage is relational, it's between two people, this marriage also teaches us something about the Prophet himself. It shows us that Prophet Muhammad had a very healthy and secure masculinity. He was remarkably comfortable in this relationship. He wasn't threatened by Khadijah's strength and power. In the sources, we don't have reports of them fighting or having periods of separation. By all accounts, they had a loving, harmonious marriage. And this conclusion is supported by the fact that after Khadija died, we have all these hadith reports in which the Prophet praises Khadija and speaks of her in a very loving and very endearing way. So why hasn't that prophetic masculinity become a model, a sunnah, an uswatun hasana that Muslim men should try to emulate in their own marriages? We think that it's high time that that should be the case.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, so the question really is, to go back to your question, Marwa, what would a sunnah that is based on the model of the marriage of Khadija and Muhammad look like? It's based on a secure masculinity, where being a man, not just any man, but the Prophet himself, I mean, we're not talking about any man. To be a man, you don't have to be rich. You don't have to be financially secure. You don't have to be older. You don't have to have a house in order to get married and to feel that you are able to resume your life. You don't have to be without fear. We talked much more about this in the paper, if you're interested in this. You don't have to be anxiety free. You are allowed to be vulnerable, and you're allowed to go into the marriage and have your wife deal with that, help you in your vulnerability. That is the type of masculinity that we're talking about if we look at that marriage. To be a wife, you don't have to be a virgin. You don't have to be inexperienced. You can be a mother. You can be a widow and a divorcee. I mean, in current times, being a divorcee alone is, huge. There's a huge taboo around this, and it's very hard for somebody who's divorced to get married, to get remarried. You don't have to be younger. You don't have to be subdued. You don't have to give up your work. These are all things. So what kind of marriages were we talking about? If the hegemonic understanding that we have right now is older, richer, financially secured man married to less financially secure younger woman, we can have a counter understanding where we can have a strong wife who supports her husband and who is also supported by her husband, for them to become their true selves in this marriage, financially, in terms of maturity, intellectually, religiously, where the partners are not threatened by each other's strengths, by previous marriages, etc. So why do we have such a problem? Why is it such, when I first gave a talk about our paper in Arabic, I almost felt like I was insulting the Prophet by saying this. And of course, it isn't an insult in our time. And this is what we see when we look at current intellectuals and how uncomfortable they are with these facts. How it's a problem, but it's our problem. It's a problem of the 21st century. And our paper doesn't look at the why. And Shadab made some suggestions, but I think this is a very important question. Why is this? And I don't think it's just patriarchy, and I don't think it's just fuqaha. I actually think a big part of it is also global patriarchal hegemonic discourse, which is not just based on Islam. In fact, I think it has more to do with Western patriarchy and European patriarchy. And how that we are trying to have this kind of bourgeois understanding of a family where the husband is the head of the household, and that has been kind of merged with our Islamic discourse. But this is not what we did in this paper. So I think this is where further research has to be done of how these discourses have become hegemonic. But what we can do is we can go back into history, and with history, try and liberate ourselves from our 21st century insecurities and anxieties.
That is what we're trying to do in Musawah, actually, through papers like yours, through knowledge like that new initiative on adl and ihsan in Muslim marriages. So that's an amazing almost conclusion, really. You are allowed to be vulnerable. I'm quoting you that you don't need to give up your work. I mean, these are all things that are unthinkable today, and they were perfectly normal back then. And no wonder, Sarah, when you gave this talk in Arabic, you felt that compared to what we have today, what the Prophet did today would be unacceptable. Astaghfirullah, even though he is the Prophet, he is the model of how we should be conducting ourselves. So thank you, Sarah and Shaddad, for these very illuminating interventions. You've really put a spotlight on a part of our Muslim history and heritage that has not been given its due attention when we came to legislate our family laws and practices. So we can clearly see that history or theory is one thing. How that is then selectively reflected into law is another thing. But then how all this becomes practice in our daily lived realities is yet a whole other thing in its own right. And so Hadil, our dear discussant, can you please reflect from your standpoint as an activist living and working in Iraq on what we just heard from Sarah and Shaddad now? Please, the floor is yours. You have 8 minutes.
Thank you, Marwa. Thank you so much. I'm really it was really very interesting topic and discussion. I will talk from my experience working in Iraq. So I grew up with an educated family. My father, who finished his higher degree in US, he was open-minded and was extremely supportive father. But still, we are strongly connected to radical religious figures in the society. I'm still thinking, do we able to challenge our mind to enhance the justice and equality for both men and women? Whenever you will discuss or argue for women's rights, like simple one, the answer is ready. وَلِلرِّجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ دَرَجَةٌ. I consider myself as a woman with deep faith. I mean, reading a lot, thinking more. Many questions have been raised in my mind while listening to khutbah in the Friday prayer, lectures, or reading articles. Whenever I ask a question, the answer would not convince me, and many times the sheikh and imam become angry about my question. I didn't find an answer to many questions, thus become more pressing when I saw how women suffer around me, which make me think, if a Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is with us now, will he accept the oppression that women live with? Everyone speaks about how great he was as a husband, but very few who follow and practice what he said. They always take and use Prophet Muhammad Hadith ﷺ to be in line with their interests and benefit based on patriarchy background, which is against what Prophet Muhammad ﷺ believed and said. I can tell you, I mean, hundreds of stories. Those reflect the reality in which we live, and it shows how far we are from religion, our religion, and its principles, where men are suffering along their life. For example, child marriage. This phenomenon disseminated more and more after 2003, increased during the forced displacement during ISIS and military operations. Many families are allocated to other areas like Kurdistan. To stay there, they need to sponsor from Kurdish people. So many cases when families' father try to secure residency or staying in Kurdistan, he needs to accept the sponsor offer to marry his daughter, even if the age difference is more than 30 or 40 years. The marriage will be outside the court for two reasons. One, the age of the marriage in Iraqi law is 18 years for the girls. And secondly, the law in Kurdistan not allowed polygamy. And this become common practice with no prosecution, no documentation. Women lost their rights and even their children's rights. So this make me ask how selective our community is regarding marriage approach, which is based on interest and benefit of men. Any dialogue about Prophet Muhammad ﷺ to Khadija, marriage to Khadija, to Sayyidina Khadija, considered as an exception. The community is not happy at all with such a case. Wife older than her husband, They keep criticize the husband as he married a woman older than him, how poor he is. While when talking about the negative consequences of child marriage, they point to Aisha age, saying this is common, no need to argue. From Iraq perspective, Iraq women and girls have enjoyed relatively more rights than many of their counterparts in the Middle East. The Iraqi constitution guaranteed equal rights to women and other laws specifically ensured their rights to vote, to attend the schools, run for political office, on property. Yet since the 1991 Gulf War, the position of women within Iraqi society has deteriorated rapidly. Women and girls were affected by economic consequence of the UN sanction and lacked access to food, healthcare, education. So these effects were compounded by changes in the law that restricted women mobility to and access to formal sector to ensure jobs to men and the piece of conservative religious and tribal groups. Iraq, for more than 4 decades now, was either pre or in or post-conflict. This put a huge impact on women and who have repeatedly been the victim of the conflict. They suffer displacement, rape, injury, death, but at the same time, Iraqi women show remarkable resilience and courage to in face of adversity. Before 2003 and during Iranian-Iraqi war, the widows had a certain privilege from the government, land, pension, cars as a competition for losing their lovers in the war, regardless of their ethnics or religion. So widows received a request to get married again. These requests were considered significant opportunities for them and their new husband, even better than young women who exposed to first marriage. Despite few bad experience at that time, but still we have had a good examples and success stories where a woman has her own financial resources and enabled to her to play a good role with powerful legislation system that not allowed any bad action against widows at that time. Currently, we have more than 1 million widows and more than 4 million orphans with very limited financial support from the government. In addition to high poverty rate and lack of a decent work opportunity makes their life condition for these vulnerable groups more difficult. Very few who decide to marry a widow, but more interest to marry a young girl. If she is a government employer, that will be another credit. The data that we have from our partners who work in Iraq with who running listening center to support women with legal and psychosocial services reflects the reality and how women suffer to get their rights and the cost they paid actually to be free from violence and to get their rights. When talking about masculinity, the problem is how community defines. Many when talking about masculinities, they can see a powerful man, maybe with one or two or maybe wives who have the rights to speak, to argue, have right to decide on behalf of a woman, to do whatever he wants because he is a man. Even among the religious persons, they put the man at the top of everything. The one who can order and forbid, while women needs to obey and follow. And they rely on a selective Prophet Muhammad period of life and selective part of Sunnah. Even if the hadith is a poor one, they keep use it as it helps them. So, finalize my talking, I want to ask two questions for Sarah and her husband. Regarding hadith for Nabi Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam about the condition or like positive models for wives. So Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam saying women may be married for 4 reasons: for her property, her ranks, her beauty, and her religiosity. So get to so get the one who is religious. May you be blessed. So that the question is that this is for women, and is there any hadith describe positive models for husband? And the second one regarding to the kafa'a, what Sarah mentioned. Who has the authority to decide and judge about kafa'a? So I ending my talk by these 2 questions, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Hadil. And thank you for this also basically wake-up call from reality. Yeah, we have many questions and we are trying to cluster them together. So let's start by the first question, which talks about the model of the prophetic marriage to Khadija. Muhammad was a husband to Khadija, Aisha, Salama, and other women. If we are to look at all his marriages together as experiences to learn from, what do we learn from these marriages holistically? Or is it only one marriage that is the role model and others serve other functions? What are your thoughts? So please, Sarah and Shaddeb, but be mindful that we have other questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, these are great questions, and some of them are more difficult than others. No, of course. I mean, so the question is, I also think one should not think of one core, like there should be one ideal marriage, but I think the idea that there can be multiple forms of marriage, and they can be good. So, for example, with one of the things that come out, for example, of all the marriages of the Prophet is that actually Aisha is the only one who was a virgin at marriage. All the others had were either widows or divorcees. So the common denominator actually between all the marriages of the Prophet were that they were already married before, not that this was their first marriage. So this is one of the things. We're not necessarily saying that even if we look at the Sunnah, that this is the only way. There is the Sunnah, there is the Quran. I mean, we can have multiple sources of legislation. But I think one of the things that is very important, and we talk about this more in the paper than we talked about this today, is that whatever we usually do is always an endeavor of the present. So we do things because it matters to us today. And of course, in Islam, we believe that the Quran is for all times and places. So we're totally allowed to do this. We are allowed to look at the problems of today and say, what does the Quran have to say about this? What does our religion have to say about this? But what is important is also that we also take the common sense of today. What is right today, and we project it onto the past in a way that often doesn't allow us to see things in the past that might be much more liberating or much more empowering. So I think that's a very important thing. With Hadith, I mean, the question about Hadith, I am not aware of one. And I think, like you said before in your presentation, I mean, with Hadith, of course, we also have a history of the Hadith that is very problematic in terms of, we have thousands and thousands of Hadith that there's no way that the Prophet could have actually said all of them. So we also have that, and the not just the ones that are hadith da'if, but so weak hadiths, but also other ones. So one has to be very careful in general with the hadith. I mean, and to your question about who decides what is kafa'a, of course, in the personal status law, it's the law. So it's about, it's whoever is the judge at the time who will say, what is the and it's usually the guardian who will say, yes, this person is kind of my social standing, of my social class. But it's not something that is, strictly defined.
Yeah, and I know that there are a lot of questions, so I just want to say very briefly that I don't think giving a counter hadith will fix the problem, and I don't think you think that either. You know, when we give the example of Khadija, we're giving a 25-year-long precedent. That's a pretty significant precedent, and yet those in authority still dismiss it, right? So I think fundamentally we're talking about the construction of religious authority, and that the producers of authority and those who consolidate authority and who make rulings are predominantly men. And I think that has to fundamentally shift. And until that shifts, we can offer all sorts of various texts, various evidences, and it will fall on deaf ears. So I think that is what really has to change. We have to democratize and make more egalitarian the construction of religious authority in Islam.
Thank you, Shaddeb. Hadil, would you like to come back to this? Would you like to respond also to what you just heard? You're muted.
Sorry, I'm just like thinking about what kind of. Sometimes we need to, to focus on family law, not for, ibadat, and how, just to enhance the relation between, to look on the at the sunnah and to focus on how we can enhance this relation between wife and husband, taking on consideration the all type of marriage of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So that will help us to sustain, the family, to sustain our relation. And I agree with what Sarah and her husband mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you, Hadil. And I think it's also important for us to note, Shaddeb's point was also very important, that no matter how much evidence we have, there is a structure. And until that structure is deconstructed, somehow we can give all the evidence we want and change is not going to happen. And that is why activists are so important in this conversation, because they are the ones who, activists like you, actually, Hadil and Sarah and Shaddeb, who are activists in their own ways, they are the ones who mobilize people to change these structures of power, really, and to challenge them and to create new structures that are more egalitarian and that subscribe to these histories, egalitarian histories that we have. And that's actually related to some of the questions we've been getting. For example, what practical steps can be taken from this research to change personal status laws in many Muslim countries? That's one question. Another one, how can we tell the story of Prophet Muhammad and Khadija and make it a mainstream story in our culture? Yeah, how can we take it beyond academia to begin really to shift the patriarchal religious perspective that's today literally killing women? These are two questions on that. Would you like to take them, Sarah and Shaddeb, and Hadil as well?
I think one of the things that is very important to do is that we need to think, when does the personal status law contradict the Quran, and when does it contradict the Sunnah? Firstly the Quran and then the Sunnah. And of course we have a lot there where we actually have the personal status law is not based on the Quran. It's based on fiqh. And fiqh is Islamic jurisprudence that was written at a specific time for a specific place, and which has now in our minds and hearts has become something that is divine, and we can't speak against it. It's almost as if we are, we're speaking against God, and we're not. Because it's actually there. So I think we need to start with looking at where the personal status law contradicts the Quran, and there's a lot there, and then also where it contradicts the Sunnah. How do we do this? I think it's, in a way, it's easy because we all know the story. This is one of the things that we found when we were doing research. Actually, there's not that much more than what we already know in terms of the sources, in terms of the stories. There's not this kind of, if you do research, you find all these details about the marriage between the Prophet and Khadija? No, actually, most of the details that we have, we do know. But what we haven't done is we haven't said, okay, so this is Sunnah. And this is where we can say this, because the people we're talking to are not going to say, oh no, that's not true. Not even the most conservative person is going to say, oh no, she wasn't older than him. Oh no, she wasn't richer than him. Oh no, she wasn't his employer. These are known facts that everyone knows. But the problem is that we haven't made them into law. We have made smaller things into law. And I think Layla Ahmed's work is very, very important here, and where she shows how kind of the social norms, the hegemonic social norms of each period have kind of infiltrated and come into the fiqh literature, and that fiqh literature then becomes this kind of divine thing that we can't counter argue, but we can, because we actually, in this sense, we agree on the story. Nothing we have said, I think, for a normal Muslim audience, nothing we have said is kind of dramatic or out of common knowledge. Actually, we all know this. So the only thing that we need to do is to say, okay, so let's take this a step further and say, fine, then this could also be a model for Islamic marriage.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to add on to that by saying a couple of things. Firstly, one of the contributions of this paper is to show that when young Muslims and contemporary Muslims position Khadija as a feminist model, there's substance to what they're saying. That is not plucked out of the sky. And we have shown through reference to the classical texts, to various prophetic biographies, Ibn Sa'ad, al-Tabari, so on and so forth, Ibn Ishaq, that actually that is the case. She pushes what we think is acceptable and not acceptable, not in the 7th century, but in our own century, in the 21st century. So that's one of the significances of the paper. Secondly, Sarah talked about some of the legal aspects, and you also asked about practical steps. It's not just about teaching Khadija and the Prophet. It's about doing Khadija and the Prophet. That when we live out, this is something that the scholar Amin Abdul taught me, your most important commitment to feminist liberation lies not in the public sphere, as important as that is, but it lies in how you set up your relationships to people in the private sphere, in the household. And in the household, we have to live out the sunnah of the Prophet and Khadija. We have to participate as men, right? We're talking about masculinity, in the work that has historically been done by women, even if women as a social group have not been compensated or even acknowledged for that type of work. We need to participate in that, be proud of that, and do what Amr Wadud calls work for Allah inside the home, just as there is work for Allah outside the home. So I think we have to live that out. And we need to support, whether in terms of our relationships with our friends or our children or our siblings, we need to support new marriages that take age and turn it upside down, that transcend class barriers, where we talk about people with similar educations also coming together, right? It's complex. That talk about matrilocal marriages and not just patrilocal marriages. So it's also about living out that precedent, and that is what the Sunnah is about. It's about living out an ideal in one's everyday life.
And we're very lucky to have you both really exemplifying that specifically. And I do know that this has been quite challenging, especially in the context that we live in today. And maybe you can have a chance at some point to share with us some of that. But also one way of living it under these unfair laws sometimes, one of the mechanisms that you've talked about is using conditions that are parts of marriage contracts. And we have some questions on that. So some people are asking you to give us examples of conditions that were parts of marriage contracts in early Islam. And I do know that you are aware of other contracts in contemporary times that maybe you can also give us examples of. Some also want sources about Khadija and Fatima's marriages. You've already given us some. If there are more, please do. So let's talk about that, the marriage contract, the conditions.
Okay, one of the very, very important conditions that we already touched upon is this: I will be the only wife. And this is actually, if you look at the personal, so we actually have this condition in our marriage contract. But under current Jordanian personal status law, what that means, even though that I will be, Shadab is not allowed to marry another wife, but he actually is allowed to marry another wife. He can go and marry somebody else. The only thing that I will have the ability to do under Jordanian personal status law is then say, okay, since you've done this, you have
breached the contract.
So I can divorce you. That's it. Now, if we only went back 100 years, I don't even want to go back to the day of the Prophet, the time of the Prophet. If we go back 100 years under Ottoman personal status law, it was that if a wife wrote this into her marriage contract, the husband would be legally prevented from marrying somebody else. So it would no longer, this would not be an option. He would not be able to do this. So this is, for example, a small difference in how this is there. So this is one thing. So what kind of things can you write into your marriage contract? Anything. And this is, I mean, I think more research has to be done. Leila Ahmed has provided quite a bit of research on this. But I mean, anything that you want, really. You can have anything there. And that is what makes it such a powerful document. But you can say, you can decide, of course, you know, what you want to do. What in terms of course, divorce, the right to divorce, the right to where you want to live, now of course as well, you know, beating or not beating. I mean, these are, you can literally put anything in there. But the problem is even this has become a taboo, because I think of this kind of frail masculinity that is always under threat, that you cannot, you know, and you can't touch. So we have the self-censorship of people saying, okay, we're not going to put anything in there. I just wanted to say something to a point that was made earlier, and something Hadil said, and I think we also need to think about this, is that, you know, the hadith with religiosity and why religiosity is important. I think we have some ayat in the Quran also speak to religiosity, and I think one of the things that when we say religiosity, what does that mean? When you say you should marry somebody who is for their religion, this is also something that goes beyond class, because it is really something about what is in yourself. So it doesn't matter how rich or poor that person is. It doesn't matter, you know, what skin color they have. It doesn't matter where they come from. It is only about the religiosity. It was something they control 100%. So you can take that also to mean different things, to kind of go and, you know, it surpasses the barriers that we put in front of who you can marry and who you can't marry. And finally, I just want to kind of speak to, you know, some of the problems that you face, that you know, just ask about, you know, what kind of problems do you face in terms of, so for example, for us, we do face a lot of legal problems because Shadab came to live with me in Jordan. He is not Jordanian. He cannot become Jordanian. Our children are not Jordanian. Because he's not Jordanian, he can't be tenured when he works as a professor at the University of Jordan. He could be asked to leave at any time. He doesn't have the right to be here. My children, if they committed a minor problem, they could actually be deported. So even my children don't have the right to be here, which means I don't have the right to be here. So through nationality law, which is based, by the way, on British French law and not on any kind of Islamic law, but that's the point. But so it is also the ability to have a matrilocal marriage is also, it becomes almost impossible if you don't allow the other person to be a full legal subject. If that person, it's not just be a full legal partner in the marriage, if you can't be full legal subject in the public sphere, then you also prevent that from happening, for us actually being able to live together.
Yeah, so it actually reaches all aspects of our lives. It's quite deep. And I think it's important here to bring the Quran as well. And because what do we do with this situation? What do we do with this lived reality and these laws? We want to go back to the Quran, and we have a couple of questions. So one of them was why, and that person thinks that the Quran, why did the Quran not reflect the Khadija Muhammad model in the various verses relating to marriage? There's another question related to it, saying, could we hear some positive aspects from the Prophet's marriage to Aisha and not limit their marriage model here to her young age and virginity only?
So I think in terms of the Quran, I think first of all, it's very important to understand the function of the Quran, because I think we reduce it to a book of law, and I think that's very problematic. If you look at references to the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wa alihi wasallam, as a name, Muhammad, we only have 4 references in the whole Quran. The Quran is a book of huda, it's a book of guidance, and that's what it focuses on. And in comparison to other texts that focus on law, such as Leviticus in the Old Testament, the Quran doesn't actually have many legal verses. And I think it's important that we understand that. We don't reduce it to a book of law. Nonetheless, the Quran does have various things to say about marriage. And I haven't researched what the Quran has to say about marriage. That's not the function of the paper. But it talks about complementarity between husband and wife. It talks about a husband and wife being of comfort to each other, of being of support to each other. And there are certain verses that talk about male authority over women. And the classic one is chapter 4, verse 34, from Surah An-Nisa, the chapter of women. الرجال قوامون على النساء. The men are the maintainers of women. But as even in Musawah's work, it's shown that this is very complex. And in the verse itself, authority, qawama, is connected to nafaqah, to spending, right? So in our times, that changes because men have, in certain cases, continue to be breadwinners, but so have women. So that's the first thing, that I don't think that we should treat the Quran as a static text when it comes to marriage. Now, again, why is it that the Quran refers to marriage in a particular way that doesn't represent that experience with Khadija and Muhammad? I'm not sure. It may be because the sabab an-nuzul, the occasion of revelation for that verse, was after Khadija had died and the social realities of the Muslim community had changed since then. We're not denying that there are verses in the Quran that can be read in patriarchal ways. But again, what we're saying is that there is a 25-year precedent, which we believe is a precedent of Sunnah in the Prophet's life, and that should challenge us in the ways in which we understand these verses that at face value may seem to be patriarchal.
And I think also, I mean, and this is, again, Musawah has done a lot of work on this. So, and this is not the purpose of this paper, but, you know, we have taken one ayah, الرجال قوامون على النساء, and we have kind of said all these things about this, what this one ayah means. We have this one interpretation, one very and we haven't taken, and Ziba Mir Husseini speaks about this, about, you know, mawadda wa rahma, love and compassion, and there's a lot of other things that we could have taken and made into a principle that we have not made into principles, even in the Quran. So I wouldn't say that the Quran does not endorse this. I think the Quran has been read in a certain way. And this goes to another very important issue. And this is something around what Amina Wadud speaks a lot about, is that we as Muslims believe that we have the right to read the Quran in our time and place as the people that we are. So we have the right as women who have a certain problem to say, I'm reading the Quran and I want a solution. And as a woman, I am reading this Quran. And this is something that is okay. It doesn't make me biased. It doesn't make, on the contrary, it's something that as a believer, I'm allowed to do, I'm supposed to do. And of course, what happens is that because historically it has been mainly men reading, their male subject position has been part and parcel of how they read it. They have read it through male eyes. But when a woman does it, they're saying, oh, she's doing it as a woman. She's trying to impose a certain agenda. Every one of us has a certain agenda. And if we say that this book is for all times and places, it needs to speak to our agenda. We need to have a conversation with the book, and we have a right to do so. And I think this is extremely important. And just finally about, you know, and absolutely, I mean, we don't want to suggest that the Prophet's marriage to Aisha is only defined by her age and that wasn't a loving marriage. And there's a lot there. I mean, and this is not what we did in the paper. And we, you know, encourage, you know, the other papers, and there have been papers about this. You know, we have Aisha as she has, you know, a third of all the hadith come through Aisha. So we have a lot to say about that, but this wasn't what we did, so I can't speak to that. But that doesn't, at no point do we want to suggest that it wasn't an equal marriage just because she was younger than him or anything like that. But all we want to say is we wanted to make a point in terms of how we understand. And I want to go back to I do hold on to this. I think our current understanding of an ideal Muslim marriage has far less to do than anything Islamic, even from Islam of 100 years ago, than actually modern, hegemonic, conservative values that are actually, in terms of their origin, do not actually come from the Islamic world. I don't think, but again, this requires further research.
Thank you, Sarah and Shaddab. And Hadil, also, please, is there anything from these questions that also spoke to your own context, your own lived reality, that you would also like to reflect with us on before I give the final question?
Yeah, I just want to maybe I believe we need to read the Sira for Prophet Muhammad, reread it again, and to make sure about all hadith and how, to work or to justify. We need to make, I think for us as activists, we need to make our voice louder, equipped by knowledge, and this depends on evidence. And that also sometimes when we are thinking about even in the Quran, for ibadat and penalty, we are both, men and women are equal in that. While for the right, here come here is that is the point. So who has the authority to give or provide men with all these rights, while Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in our daily ibadat, daily hajj, we are equal. So how we can, it's I think it's a big question, need to be answered.
Yes. And maybe the final question that we have can help us collectively try and answer this as well, Hadil. So let's end it again with the Quranic Revelation. And so after the Prophet Muhammad's first earth-shattering encounter with the angel Jibreel and the very first Quranic revelation in the cave of Hira, he fled back to Khadija for comfort and affirmation. What is, in your opinion, the metaphysical and spiritual meaning of her role in confirming the sublime veracity of this revelation? And that touches upon what you just said right now, Hadil. Yeah. So I pose this question to all of you. Khadija's role in the birth of Islam is so fundamental. What does it say really about her being given the chance to confirm the veracity of this revelation and her fulfilling that duty?
Hadil, would you like to go first if you have any thoughts?
No. Yeah, you can. I think if I can add something, I believe what Marwa mentioned is fundamental role for Khadija, how she supports Prophet Muhammad, how she push him forward, and this gives us an idea about how the power of the woman, how she can use it and to support and to support her family. But again, I think it's sometimes still we need to rethink about and to challenge our mind as well, to put that in paper and to build our knowledge for it further. So that's my point.
Thank you, Hadil.
So I think we really need to reflect on this. The Quranic revelation, that first revelation, is fundamentally connected to Khadija. Right? What does that mean? Is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala giving us some clues that the Prophet receives revelation in the cave of Hira, he goes running, he asks Khadija to cover him, and Khadija covers him, listens to what he says, and says in the words of Ibn Ishaq, quote, "Rejoice, O son of my uncle, and be of good heart. Verily, by him in whose hand is Khadijah's soul, I have hoped that you will be the prophet of this people," end quote. You know, in the Quran it says, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ أَمْ عَلَىٰ قُلُوبٍ أَقْفَالُهَا. Do they not reflect upon the Quran, or are there locks on their hearts? What does it mean that Khadija was so closely connected to the revelation? What does it mean that the first Muslim was a Muslimah? What does that mean? Is Allah telling us, and it's a question, right? I don't have the answers. Is Allah telling us that we need to understand the Quran in the light of her experience with the Prophet, that she has to be a part of the lens through which we understand the Quran? What we know is that she was right there with the Prophet, and we have her supportive role in the early revelations, not only in the Sirah, the biography of Ibn Ishaq, but also in At-Tabari and Ibn Kathir and other scholars as well. And this goes back to masculinity. When Khadija shows a supportive role, what is Allah trying to tell us? Is Allah trying to tell us that it's okay as a man, as a believing man, to have fear, to have anxiety, to have doubt? Can this be a clue that this is also what it means to live out one's Islam, to live out one's submission to the one God, and to have that type of masculinity where you don't have to have all the answers right away, where you don't have to be strong, because ultimate strength lies with Allah, right? And as a community, we try to build strength collectively through our relationship with each other. We have a name for that. It's called marriage, right? So is that what is happening here? So I think it's something that should push us to think and to raise questions in our minds. And I think that we haven't done justice to Khadijah's presence during the early revelations because we've reduced it to some interesting story. And I don't think it's just an interesting story. I think it's something, we think it's something that should be a paradigm and a model for us as Muslim women and men to emulate in our own times in the 21st century.
No, absolutely. I just want to kind of just underline some of the things that Shadab has just said. I mean, it is her interpretation. It is Khadija radiallahu anha's interpretation that is the first interpretation of Islam. She tells the Prophet that he's a prophet. She's the first Muslim before the Prophet himself. She speak. I mean, this is huge. And I think one of the things that we have as Muslims, we've become so scared of asking difficult questions. We constantly, astaghfirullah, stuff. Don't say this. Don't say this. Oh my God, you're insulting God. We have stopped pushing. We have stopped, like, what is it about? It's not just a story that a first grader, you can, yes, learn the story in first grade, but how do you interpret the story? What do you learn from it? How do you push the boundaries? And I think this is one of the things that, again, where hegemonic masculinity is so toxic in that men they are not allowed to feel. They have to be providers. They have to be supermen. You know, they have to be superhuman. They have to be this kind of they have to be economically everything. It's exhausting. It's exhausting for them. It's not. And actually, if you look at the Quran, whether it is, it's the prophets, all the prophets, they are vulnerable. They make mistakes, and they make big mistakes. They don't make small mistakes. I mean, Prophet Musa makes big mistakes, and they're forgiven, and they cry, and they're allowed to be human, and because again, like Shadab said, there is no superhuman. There's God, and there's an arrogance in hegemonic masculinity now that almost wants to make male into semi-gods that we worship. And of course, it's not a coincidence that my children say to me, "Yeah, I know we're not supposed to think about God, but when you think about God, we think about an old man." Of course they do, because that is exactly, there's shirk in the way we think about God as a man, as this all-powerful man. And I think this is very important, separating the perfect, which is only the divine, and then having our imperfections as humans, where we make mistakes, where we're scared, and we speak much more to this in the paper. We have a lot on that, actually. We have a whole section where we talk about this, where we cry, where we doubt, seriously doubt, where we go to where we go to insanity and come back. But that is the vulnerability of humanity, and that is where the God of the Quran allows us to do this, and actually in this relationship, that a relationship gives us the ability to do it together, where we're not just alone, but we're in that relationship. The relationship allows us to kind of become the best human that we can in our imperfection.
Wow, that is a very powerful ending. Thank you. So I'm going to try and synthesize this, and it's very difficult to do so after such a powerful intervention from all of you. So I guess we can see that we do have hidden gems in our Islamic history and heritage, such as that marriage model we have from the Prophet and Sayyidah Khadija. It's really a model, as in your words, it allows us to be human again, whether we are women or men. Yeah. However, what we eventually choose from this heritage and then selectively reflect it into law is actually a political choice, not a religious one. Yeah. It's a choice that favors the interests of certain groups in society and certain values over others. We are seeing today that from lived reality that this hegemonic patriarchal conception of masculinity is causing significant challenges for many women and men. And as you rightly mentioned, Sarah, the men are also suffering from this toxic masculinity. We know, for example, from the World Health Organization that males globally live shorter lives than females unnecessarily because of dominant constructions of masculinity, such as the notions of invulnerability, and the promotion of risk-taking, which endorse all sorts of violence and behavior, and the lack of use of healthcare services, for example, that not only impacts relationships negatively, but also, if you want to be pragmatic, public health and economies more broadly. So you gave us a very profound example of how we can try and live a different type of masculinity, in our personal lives. We should also note that Muslim family laws globally have started responding to this realization, although at a slow pace. And so we are now seeing positive developments and reforms that go in the direction of a more egalitarian and just family model based on a healthier conception of masculinity. We are seeing the abolishment of wifely obedience, for example, the sharing of the responsibility between of the family between spouses, criminalizing domestic violence, and so on. And we're going to find more of these examples on Musawah's positive developments table, which my colleagues will copy into the chat here. And so, yes, obviously, there are challenges, serious ones, but what we've heard from you is that there is also a way. Others have gone in that path before us, none less than the Prophet himself, alayhi salatu wassalam. So may we rise to the occasion and follow in his footsteps, for therein may lie a great reward. Wallahu a'lam, and God knows best. Thank you very much. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marwa. And we will now launch a quick survey. My colleague Suri will launch it now. And if you can, please stay on to answer these two short questions, because it's very important. It allows us to know and better understand how you experience this webinar. And while you're responding to the survey, I just want to thank again Dr. Sarah, Dr. Shadab, Hadil, Marwa for this extremely captivating and thought-provoking conversation. We had so many insightful feedback and comments in Facebook and in Zoom. You shared with us so many gems. What does it mean that the first Muslim was the first Muslimah? What does it mean that the Prophet was vulnerable, had doubt? And really your analysis of the marital relationship of the Prophet ﷺ with Khadija is pushing us to reflect on our own relationships in our contemporary time. It's really inspiring for us young Muslims who are looking for empowering narratives from our tradition. I also want to thank our audience for your constructive and valuable questions to the speakers. And if you enjoyed this webinar, there will be more coming up in the next couple of weeks, inshallah. We hope you will be able to join us. Please check our website and follow our social media pages for more information. And I would like also to thank the amazing team that is supporting us in the back end, Suri and Rasha, and also the other members of Musawah's team. The recording will be available on Musawah's Facebook and also on our YouTube channel. And if you have any follow-up questions about this webinar, the series, or the research initiative, you can email us at sara@musawah.org.